I'm a qualified counsellor, and I also teach counselling courses, levels 2, 3 and 4, all the way through, so people can become qualified counsellors. I train people as Samaritans, and I deliver wellbeing training. So essentially you're looking at someone who spends a lot of time listening to people. So I've been doing this for a number of years now, and I really, really enjoy it. So hopefully you'll get that as we go through. So here's the plan. Discuss the 4 types of listening, because there are 4 types which you may not be aware of. And I'll be asking you during that initial discussion if you can associate with those types as well, maybe for yourself, but also for others in your life. We're going to look at empathic listening, and then we're going to bring in a bit of theory. So some of you might have heard of something called the hierarchy of needs by Maslow. If you haven't, that's fine. I want to show it to you. It's a really basic model, and why listening is so powerful. So that's where the theme of this comes from. If you haven't been convinced at that point, you know, I'm going to talk about the benefits of being a good listener as well. Then, as Gurpreet said, we're going to do a breakout group, and we're going to look at, if listening is so important, what can stop us listening to people. And then after we get back together, I want to talk about a toolbox of skills that I'm going to be sharing with you. And then hopefully you'll be able to take those away and use them in whatever listening capacity in any relationship that you have. And then, as Gurpreet said at the very end, any questions on that'll be fab. I'll be around at the end. So, in the chat box, if you can, what do you think makes someone a good listener? If you can put your thoughts on that'll be great. Okay, we got 4 people so far. That's awesome. Patience, thank you. Genuine interest, yeah, and we talk about authenticity and genuineness when we're communicating. That's really important. And paying attention, yeah. Not talking about yourself, true, because a lot of people can speak from their own perspective and identify rather than empathize, which is very different. So good point. So some good thoughts on there as well. Thanks for that. Okay, so if we go on, it's interesting when you think about it. At school, you're taught to read, write, and how to speak, but we're not taught to listen. We're told to listen by a teacher, you know, sit on the carpet, do this, do that, but not actually the value of listening as a skill. So I've used an analogy of like a fairy tale here. It feels like listening is the Cinderella skill compared to her heavyweight sister skills in the school curriculum, because those are the ones which I think sometimes people think, actually, you know, those are the big ones. You have to read, write, you need to show and demonstrate certain things. And I also wonder if that's due to the fact that, well, people get confused between hearing and listening. So in case you think, well, you know, you have ears, you know, those, if you hear something, that is a passive activity. If you are listening properly, that is an active skill, which is why it takes a lot of time and practice and skills and courses sometimes to actually develop those skills. Okay, so 4 types of listening. So I want to go through this and then have a think. I'm going to do a poll and see what you think. So if we're pretending to listen, now you may have experienced this, you know, when someone is pretending to listen to you, because there'll be a lot of body language, there'll be a lot of eye contact, and it won't really be on you. You might also hear words like, yeah, right. And you'll know when someone is pretending to listen to you, and you just, and personally, when that's happened to me, I just think, I don't know why I should bother. So pretending to listen, they might have 5 to 10% of what you've said, maximum. Selective listening. This is where you've got someone who is paying attention to perhaps part of what you're sharing. That can be for a variety of reasons. It could be that they're in their own head. They've got so much in their mind that they're going, yeah, I can hear that bit, but you know, the rest of it's all a little bit blurry. The other reason people might have selective listening is because they're focusing perhaps on the one thing that you're communicating, which they understand. So they're going, I don't understand anything she's just said, but actually I've hooked onto that bit, so I'm going to ask questions about that. Selective listening is essentially filtering. You're filtering what someone's saying, so you're not really getting the full picture. Then we move on to attentive listening. Attentive listening is you're starting to get someone who's actually paying attention to what you're sharing. And if you think about that in the workplace, attentive listening is where you are paying attention to what the words that someone's saying with a purpose of understanding them, because perhaps you need to take action. So as an example, in a work meeting, you might be a manager, you pay attention to someone in the room who's talking because you need to understand what's going on with the project they might be working on, because you have to report back to somebody else. For example, in the home, if you've got a child who comes home crying, for example, you focus all your attention on what they're saying because you might need to take action and speak to a teacher or another parent or something like that. So what we've got is someone who's paying attention to the words with the aim of doing something with that information for themselves or to take action. Now, empathic listening. Empathic listening is quite different because it involves almost something which you would call a paradigm shift, a completely different way of thinking about listening to someone. So when you're listening empathically, it's not actually about you at all wanting to do anything. You're doing it because you want to understand the other, whoever the other is, because it feels morally right to do. It feels ethically right to do. You are giving them your time and you're showing that you give them value, not because you want to find out anything for yourself. So it's not about the self when you do empathic listening. You want to understand that person deeply, but also through different skills, which I'll go through later, you'll help them share more. So what I'll do now is, if I can do a poll. So I'll launch that now and see what you think about it. What type of listener do you think you are? Or if you're not sure, you can go with that. Brilliant. Okay, that's 12 of you who've responded. So we've got quite a few people thinking they're attentive and empathic, which is great. Sometimes selective, you know, and I think even if you're someone who listens empathically sometimes, if you've got stuff going on in your own head and the cup is full, sometimes you might be selective because you can't always hear everything that everyone's saying. Okay, we've got a few more people haven't responded, but if that would just give you a few more seconds, if you can put that in there if you feel able. So what we'll do now is we're going to go on and just have a little look at, when we think of empathic listening, another way to view it is getting in the hole with someone. It feels like it's the end game for interpersonal communication, but it's not easy. To put yourself to one side and literally be there for somebody else takes three things: an effective use of skills, which is what I'll go through later on; courage, to put yourself in a situation when you're in the hole with someone, and say someone's speaking to you about something that's quite distressing, actually that does take courage to go, you know, what's that like for you? Tell me a bit more about that. That takes courage in some instances. And as we've said, a paradigm shift for the listener, knowing the value of doing that type of listening. It's not a self-serving technique that's done to someone. I don't know if you've ever been around anyone where it feels like they're just faking paying attention to you, and you know it feels fake when someone's not being genuine, as someone put earlier on the chat. So there's some research here by a guy called Bodie who says that listening is deeply rooted in the context of its ability to help create, maintain and enhance positive interpersonal relationships. One might go as far as to say that listening is the quintessential positive interpersonal communication behaviour, as it shows an appreciation of and an interest in the other. So what we're seeing here is just like a real valuing of what another person could be communicating about, and a genuineness to that. So some of you may have heard of this book. It's very popular. Stephen Covey, The 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. So the statement up there is habit 5. Seek first to understand, then to be understood. But what he notes is most people don't listen with the intent to understand. Instead, they listen with the intent to reply. So here what we're saying is that, similar to what somebody put in the chat, is that someone who is intending to reply because they want to get their point across, it's being about them and it's not about the other. So you'll notice this especially in people if they interrupt, because although many people have the myth that we can multitask, we can't. So if someone is talking to you and you're already, and you interrupt, you had switched off halfway through, were planning what you're about to say and then say it. So when someone is interrupting, they can't possibly be listening to you fully because they're already in their own head planning a response. So that's where interrupting is. If you notice that in people that are around you, they just kind of switched off from you and they're planning their response. So it's not helpful. But also we talk about other people. You know, at various times in this talk, I'm going to suggest to you to just notice it in yourselves as well. You know, sometimes it's quite difficult to sort of hold the mirror up and go, you know what, I've interrupted people at times. I wanted to get my thoughts out there too. And just be mindful that what that message is to the other person. So a very basic premise for effective listening: for you to understand me, you have got to stop talking. It really is that simple. So for example, when I'm on the phones at Samaritans, if I'm talking for less than 80% of the time, then that is perfect. That's because the caller should be doing the talking. And in a counselling relationship, the client should be talking a lot more than I am. If I'm talking, I'm learning nothing because it's already in my head. So by using silence, which is one of the skills of listening, I'm able to understand the other person by giving them time and space to speak. So if you want to understand what the other person's going through, you've got to close this and use these. Essentially, that's absolutely what that's about. So this is quite interesting because, and we'll put something in the chat in a second, so give yourself some thoughts on this, see what you think about this, is that empathy drives connection, sympathy drives disconnection. Now, that's by a lady called Brené Brown, and I've put a little recommendation on the bottom there because she's done a really short clip, about 5 minutes long. If you Google empathy versus sympathy, Brené Brown, it's very powerful to show how empathy and sympathy are very different. So when we offer sympathy to another, frequently we use closed statements. I'm sorry for your loss. And ask yourself, what happens then? Usually the person who may have lost someone will say, thank you. And then it stops. And then it becomes awkward. So when we offer sympathy, frequently it's a disconnecting conversation to have. I'm sorry you've lost your job. Thanks. Then what? When we give empathy, we use skills which open the conversation and allow the other person to share their experience. I understand your parents died. How are you coping with that? Which is an example of an open question. Or you've lost your job. What's that like for you? Another open question. So here, when we think about that hole analogy that I used earlier, when you're showing empathy to someone and they're in a hole, if it's a loss of any kind, it's almost like getting a ladder and sort of climbing down in there with them. So by climbing down in there, you're using a variety of questions to go, right, what's that like? Tell me more about that. Because then you're showing empathic listening and communication and not closing yourself off and distancing. So you're at the top of the hole whilst they're in it. Okay, so with that idea in mind, what I'd like to do is just show you a poll now and just see what you think about that. What I might ask you to do is, in the chat, what you can put is, what do you now feel about empathy and sympathy? Have you had any different thoughts? After my explanation of it, what do you now think about empathy, sympathy? Especially if you're someone who's given sympathy before. So if you can write your thoughts on that, that'd be great. So empathy is amazing when offered. It can feel a bit hollow, good point, because, and also when you think about sympathy, it's actually about you. Because you're saying, I'm sorry for your loss, for example. So when we think about the I, it's about us frequently. Okay, anyone else have any other thoughts that they're typing away there? Yeah, thanks for your thoughts. I think when you actually, it's interesting when we think about, when we pick things apart, like when we say things like, I'm sorry for your loss, it comes out very naturally. But actually, we think, actually, if you break that down, as I've just said, you know, I'm sorry for your loss, it's actually about us, and it's not about the other. So when we're offering empathy, it's about them. So if you feel like you really still want to say, I'm sorry that you've lost someone, so I'm sorry for your loss, but tell me a bit more about that. How are you coping? That's where you might mix those two up, and it can be quite nice for someone to kind of hear that. Exactly. Thinking, so saying I don't want your sympathy, it can feel disconnecting. You're right. And also sometimes it can feel a little pitying, you know. It's that whole rubby your shoulder thing. And I don't know how I would feel if somebody was that way with me. It can feel a little bit difficult at times. Okay. So let's go on to the next one. Oh, there we are. Now, here we have a lovely model. This is the model by Abraham Maslow, his hierarchy of needs. Now, many of you might have heard of this, because essentially what it means is in order for you to thrive as a human being, you need all of those things in order. So at the very base, you need basic psychological needs: breathing, food, water, shelter, clothing. Once those are established, then you can move up to the next level, safety and security. And then you move on. What I'd like to do is just highlight those two levels at the moment, because if we think about our current situation in the lockdown, I've spoke to a lot of clients and a lot of students who've said, I've got all this time at home, I just can't get my head into reading books, I've got all this time to do all these courses, I just can't think. Well, is it surprising when we're in a situation where we're concerned about our own health, and the health of those around us? We may not at the very beginning, as you'll recall with the supermarkets, everyone rushing to buy their own weight in toilet rolls, for example. These very basic things, these are very basic needs. So it's not surprising that people don't feel able to reach the higher levels up, that creativity, and let me learn about a course, if they're worried about their health. So if anyone's been worried about, oh, I've not used this time, I should have done more, I would be kind to yourself and say, actually, it's not surprising that a lot of people have struggled to use that time and get themselves in the right headspace when they've been down in those basic levels of need. So say those two levels are secured, you then move up, love and belonging. So this is where you get a sense of connection with others. And this is where listening starts to really kick in. Because in order for you to get that sense of connection, you'll need to feel that's involving in interpersonal relationships. It could be work, family, any community groups you're involved with. It involves speaking and listening to others and being heard. So if you're getting that sense from somebody else, that you feel connected to someone, they've heard me, then you feel valued. If you've ever experienced someone's just ignored you or ignored what you've said at home, or at work, it makes you feel your sense of worth and value is affected. So when we say love and belonging, that's not just necessarily those areas of family and friendship. It can also be at work. So that sense of being connected at work and just being in a meeting and feeling valued as well and connected to those in the room, that your voice is important. If you have that established, then you can go up to the self-esteem area, where one of the key things there is having the respect of others. And the way you get that is through their actions and also their communication to you. So if you feel respected and if you feel valued, then it makes you feel good. So for example, at work, if someone says, you did a really great presentation, I really got a lot from that, then you might go, oh, that feels lovely, and it does improve your self-esteem. So if any of you are in a position of management or where you're responsible for others, just those little things, and I think we forget that as adults, just that, well done, that was really good, I really enjoyed that, I got a lot from that, it really helps. And also, when I introduce the listening skills in a bit, the way you speak to people and the skills you use, again, links in with that sense of connection and the respect of others. Because what we're saying here is, for a person to thrive generally in life, we must have all those things in place for someone to self-actualize or grow. So if you're able in any relationship, if it's with your children, your partner, colleagues, to just give them that sense of, I'm listening to you, I value what you're sharing, then you will see this virtuous cycle as you go up this pyramid, and you will be influencing them go all the way through. Okay, so if I haven't hooked you now, this slide will definitely get you as to why being a good listener is important. So good listeners are more liked and rated as more attractive. I think I've got you all there with that one. They obtain greater trust from others than those less proficient at listening, have higher academic motivation and achievement, have better socio-emotional development, and have a higher likelihood of upward mobility in the workplace. So you can see in those points there, that's about workplace, that's about friendships, that's about all relationships which are affected if you are seen to be a good listener. Okay, so what we're going to do now is we're going to go into breakout groups and discuss what can stop you listening to another person, because what we're saying is listening is so important, and yet frequently there are barriers to listening. So you might want to think about, when you go into your breakout groups, I'm not sure if you can see this slide, so you might want to make a couple of points if you've got any paper in front of you. Think about, what can someone say that would make you just switch off? What about their physical appearance or behaviour which could make you stop listening to them? What practical things could stop you listening to them? And also bringing it into yourself. What about your state of mind and your ability to listen? So what can be going on for you which can be a barrier? Because if you're aware of all of these barriers, then that will help you become better listeners, because hopefully you'll become aware of doing these different things. Barriers to listening. So having a mobile phone physically present. There's research that shows that the empathy between people, just by having a phone on a table switched off, reduces the emotional contact between people. So if you're ever in a meeting, a business meeting, it's really tempting to just have a phone on the table, but it can actually reduce communication. And at home as well, just having phones around when people are talking can be quite distracting. I won't go through all of these, but one of them that's quite interesting is your own agenda, wanting to get your point across or to feel needed. The speaker's tone of voice. If someone's using a monotone voice, yes, I did that, and then this happened. It feels like a soul-destroying kind of conversation, isn't it? So the tonality that someone uses can be difficult to stay with them. A bit we were speaking about before is feeling triggered by the topic. So say you've got stuff going on in your own life, and actually you just don't want to hear somebody else's stuff because of those issues. That can be really hard. We've got some very basic things in there. So accent, language barrier, technology, things like that. Those can stop communication as well between people. Okay, so we've looked at how important listening is. We've done a bit of theory. We've looked at what stops us listening. So what I want to do now is kind of finish with this. So these are the listening skills. So I just want to go through them with you in turn. So open questions to start with. Now those are, you might find it helpful actually to draw this and just sort of write a few points around that. That might be helpful. So open questions are the who, what, when, where, how questions. And also, you might have heard the acronym of TED, but not to do with TED Talks. That would be tell me, explain to me, describe to me. So tell me about that. What's that like? Explain to me what your day is looking like at the moment. Describe that pain you're suffering. Tell me about that. So those three things there can be really helpful. You'll notice when I speak about open questions that the absence of why. We avoid asking why questions at all costs, and if there's one thing you take away from this presentation is to remove why from your vocabulary, because when we ask a why question of someone, we're questioning their decision making and their thoughts, which for many people will result in a very defensive response. So if you've ever said to someone, why did you do that? The answer is frequently going to be, because I wanted to, or it will be in that tone. So if you remove a why question and you switch it up for a what, so when that happened, what was the thinking going on behind that? Will get you a far better response than, why did you do that?
Yeah.
It feels very confrontational, a why question. So this is why we avoid it. Reacting. Reacting is a really important skill because it shows someone that you really are understanding them and what they're going through. If someone tells you that they just lost their job and you say, that sounds really hard, there's no humanness in that response. So when we react, we're showing someone that has meaning. So saying to someone, you've lost your job, that sounds difficult, tell me about that. That feels more human and it feels warm. Silence is an important listening skill. Many people struggle with silence. The other way I like to think of silence is thinking time. So it gives, especially if you're talking about a lot of very difficult things, actually silence can be hugely helpful to help someone process their thoughts, especially if their head feels like a bag of knitting with all these things going all over the place. If you're constantly questioning someone, they might feel overwhelmed. So silence can be useful. If you are someone who struggles with silence, what I would suggest is when you think you want to say something, that urge to reply because the silence is tricky, just in your mind count to 5 and then respond. Because in that time, you might find that they come back and they say something. Reflecting, that's a skill where you're literally mirroring words that someone's used. So if someone says, in that meeting, he really upset me when he said that, what did you think? You might then reflect. So you're upset. So what I've done there is I've picked out the key emotion word, which was upset, and I've reflected it back to them. The purpose of that is to say, I've heard this, and I want you to say more. It's not to interrupt or to stop the flow, but it's just to say, I've heard that bit, and I want you to know that I've heard it. Summarizing is a skill that you can use that's really helpful, for example, at the end of meetings, or perhaps things in a more formal setting than at home. So summarizing a meeting literally says to every single attendee that you've heard what they've said. So excellent skill to use if you're a manager. So my understanding of the meeting is, you're going to do this, we've spoken a lot about that, these are the actions that you have both taken on, that's my understanding, is that right? Now that says to everyone that you've literally heard everyone in the room and they feel respected, which totally links in with that pyramid with regards to feeling respected. So for you as a manager, that says to people, oh, she's heard me, she heard my contribution, she's aware of the actions. So it's a really good skill in quite a formal setting. Clarifying is used in a variety of different ways. It's really helpful when someone's being vague. So if someone says to you, oh, I'm feeling a bit down at the moment, or they say, I'm not feeling great, what does that mean? So when someone says something quite vague, you might say, so when you feel a bit down, what do you mean when you say that? Or can you tell me more about that? This is where, if you imagine a funnel, clarifying is you start at the top with something quite vague and you come down to something where you're getting something quite specific. In the example I used a minute ago with the business meeting, you know, when you've summarized everything, you'll notice I said, did I get it right? Again, that's clarifying. So I've summarized the meeting and I've clarified my understanding as well. So when we're clarifying with people, we're sort of checking in that what we've heard is correct. Because what we hear is our perception. That doesn't mean it's right. So when you say, this is what I've heard from the meeting, but that's my understanding, is that correct? You're leaving yourself open to be corrected. And that is a very powerful skill as any manager, because you're showing that you want to understand and get the facts straight from all the people around you. Again, it's showing respect for those around you. Encouraging is a really good skill for anyone, for example, who's struggling to talk, or perhaps either in a home situation. Maybe you've got a child who struggles to verbalize what they're saying. You might say, you know, take your time. You know, you're doing a really good job. You know, I'm here for you. That's a way of encouraging someone to talk, and you being there so you can use some of these other skills. Encouraging can also be very useful. Say in a management meeting, you've got somebody who's looking really anxious and really nervous. Saying to someone, you know, I can see you're nervous, but take your time. You know, it's just acknowledging that you see their distress, but also just trying to calm them down as well. So it's encouraging people to keep talking. Paraphrasing is probably one of the best skills you can have a go at and try, because paraphrasing is where someone may have spoken at length about something and you've literally gone into two or three sentences, or maybe one. So someone talks a great deal about their situation with their family, for example, and you say, so what I've heard you tell me is, you know, you're not sleeping very well, you're worried about your daughter, and your health isn't that great. That sounds like a lot to deal with. That person may have spoken for 20 minutes and you've just gone to what they've just said. And in my experience, when I've done paraphrasing, either on the phones at Samaritans or with clients, I've seen people go, yeah, that's exactly it. And you get that sense, that physical, yes, she's got me. She's heard what I've said. So paraphrase, you put in your own words what someone's just said. Now, the other thing about all of these skills is all of them but one show empathy. The one that doesn't show empathy is open questions, because an open question is a way that's generally at the very beginning of the conversations, you're trying to find out information. So what happened then, and who was there? How did that happen? These are fact finding, and they don't feel warm, do they, when you hear that? So if you're someone who in your job needs to ask a lot of questions, doing too many open questions can feel like an interrogation. So the key with these skills is to sort of pepper them in, use a variety of them, so that so you might reflect a few things, react to a few comments, clarify a few points, paraphrase a few things. This is when you're using a variety of these skills at a good level, and it shows that actually it's a variety of ways to listen to someone. So avoid over questioning people. If you just reflect back what someone's saying all the time, you sound like a parrot. You're upset, you're sad, you're angry, you'll just get annoyed with someone who's doing that. So any of these skills used too much isn't great. This is where having quite a balanced approach is really helpful. Okay, so that's one of the this is essentially the toolbox for listening. This is what I teach when I'm teaching counsellors and Samaritans. This is the foundation of any type of listening skill. So what I thought I would do is suggest that you put in the chat box, looking at those listening skills, which one skill are you going to try first following this session? I don't necessarily mean straight afterwards on those people in your house, which you can try, but you know, which one might you try first? And I'll put them back up so you can see. But if you can put it in the chat box, that would be fab. Awesome. So lots of people thinking about trying paraphrasing and also clarifying, thinking about perhaps rewording using why, and a bit of silence as well people want to have a go at. So amazing things happen in silence. Everyone thinks it's empty, but actually a lot goes on in it. It's never dead time. Something's always happening in it. Okay, so what I would suggest to you before I kind of leave you is I'd like to share with you a quote. Because one of the ways that I'd like to describe empathic listening, and this is what I train when I'm training Samaritans, but also counsellors, is how important empathic listening is, but also how it feels to receive it. The way I describe it is it's almost like giving someone a verbal hug. It's a genuineness, it's a warmth, and it can feel very safe when someone's communicating with you in that way. So I just wanted to read a quote to you. I had a lot on my mind and was struggling with what to do. She listened to me and allowed me to share what I was worrying about. She reflected back to me what she heard me say, and I felt calmer knowing that she'd really listened to me. I felt a warmth towards her. She gave me her time and made me feel valued, and that what I was going through was important. So here, what you've got is someone who's sharing that verbal hug. That feels like what this person has gone through, is that they feel held by someone just because they felt that connected to someone, and also that they felt that what they were sharing was important. And again, that links in with the hierarchy that I spoke about, because it's linking in with being respected. This person feels respected by the other person and valued.